When we design assessments, one of the most important questions we can ask is not just what standard am I assessing, but also what kind of learning does this question require students to show? Although they can somewhat be correlated, keep in mind that target types are not really the same as DOK levels. Think of it this way: learning target type tells us what kind of learning students must show. DOK tells us how deeply students must think to show it. So, target type, what are students doing to show evidence of learning? And DOK, how much thinking does that doing require? What is the rigor level? So, how does this affect testing? When teachers use both target type and DOK, they create stronger assessments because they can check for two kinds of alignment. First, evidence alignment. Does the question allow students to show the right kind of learning? For example, if the target is a skill, students should actually perform or apply the skill. Rigor alignment: does the question require the right depth of thinking? An example is if the standard asks students to analyze, the question should not stop at identifying. When both are aligned, the assessment is much more likely to measure the standard accurately. Let's go over learning target types. A learning target tells us what students should know, understand, or be able to do. But not all targets ask students to demonstrate learning in the same way. Some targets ask students to recall information. Some ask them to use reasoning. Others require a performance, a product, or a skill. So when we create test questions, we need to think carefully about the type of learning target behind the question. For example, if the learning target is a knowledge target, then students may need to identify, define, recognize, or recall important information. A multiple choice matching question might work well here because the goal is to determine whether students know specific information. But if the learning target is a reasoning target, then the questions should ask students to analyze, compare, evaluate, infer, or justify. In this case, a simple recall question will not give us enough evidence. We need students to show how they are thinking. That might require a constructed response, text-based explanation, or a question that asks them to choose the best answer and support it with evidence. If the learning target is a performance or skill target, then students need to demonstrate a process or strategy. For example, students may need to revise a sentence, use context clues, annotate a passage, or apply a grammar concept in context. The question should allow students to actually show that skill, not just talk about it. For a product target, students create something that meets certain criteria. This might be a simple paragraph, an argument, a presentation, a research product, or some type of written response. In this case, the assessment needs a rubric or clear success criteria so that students and teachers know what quality looks like. This matters because when the test question does not match the learning target type, the assessment can give us misleading information about learning. For example, if a standard asks students to analyze how an author develops a central idea, but our test question only asks students to identify the central idea, we've lowered the rigor. Students may get the question right, but they've not shown the full thinking required by that standard. That little mismatch can create a big problem. It may look like students have mastered the standard when they've actually mastered only a small piece of it. Using learning target types help us avoid that problem and help teachers make better instructional decisions. When we know what type of target a question is measuring, we can better interpret student performance. If students miss a knowledge question, they may need vocabulary support or perhaps some type of direct instruction. If they miss a reasoning question, they may need modeling, discussion, or practice with analysis. If they struggle with a skill-based question, they may need guided practice and feedback. And if they struggle with a product, they may need clearer criteria, examples, or revision opportunities. So learning target types help us move beyond simply just asking, did our students get it right or wrong? Instead, we can ask what kind of thinking or performance broke down. That's a much more useful question. When teachers design test questions with learning target types in mind, assessments become more aligned and more rigorous and more instructionally useful. They help us measure the intended learning instead of accidentally measuring something smaller, easier, or unrelated. In short, learning target types help us make sure that our questions match the standard, match the level of thinking, and give us the evidence we actually need. Because the goal of assessment is not just to collect grades. The goal is to collect evidence of learning, evidence that helps us know what students understand, what they can do, and what support they need next. In summary, when we design test questions, DOK helps us protect the rigor of the standard. It reminds us to ask whether students are simply recalling information, applying a skill, analyzing evidence, or synthesizing ideas across a larger task. But DOK is not the same as the learning target type. The learning target type tells us what kind of learning students need to demonstrate: knowledge, reasoning, skill, product, or disposition. DOK tells us how deeply students need to think as they demonstrate that learning. Both of these matter. If we only think about target type, we may choose the right kind of task, but make it too easy. If we only think about DOK, we may create a rigorous question that still does not measure the intended learning. But when we use them together, we design assessments that are aligned, rigorous, and useful. We're no longer just writing questions. We're collecting the right evidence at the right level of thinking. That's how assessment becomes more than just a grade. It becomes a clear picture of what students know, what they can do, and what they are ready to learn next.